Welcome to today's session, everyone, and I have the pleasure of being joined today by Phil Shih, and I'm going to let Phil introduce himself in a moment. But before I do, just a quick introduction on us for those of you who are not familiar. My name is Hartland Ross, and I'm joined by Devin Rose here of eBridge Marketing. We are a digital marketing agency. We started about 20 years ago, focused on the IT services space, and then expanded into the M&A space about 15 years or so ago, putting buyers and sellers together. And we now operate two lines of business under the eBridge site for our marketing business, and the host broker and the MSP broker for our M&A practice. So I'd like to introduce you to Phil Shih of Structured Research. Phil, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure having you. I've known Phil for many years, and for those of you who might not be familiar, Phil and his team are analysts covering the infrastructure space globally, and publishes subscription-based content that he can tell you a little bit more about. So Phil, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then we can kind of jump into a Q&A.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy New Year. And thanks for the quick introduction. I'm Phil Shih. I'm the founder of Structured Research. As Hartland mentioned, we're very focused. We're a targeted research. We like to think of ourselves as a boutique focused on the infrastructure services ecosystem. And that includes everything from hosting companies, MSPs, data center operators, following what's going on in the public cloud, covering the space for 20 years, and got my start in this business about the same time Hartland did about 20 years ago, and both of us have started just speaking with hosting companies, working with hosting companies, and have watched the sector evolve over the years. And so here we are 20 years later, still at it, right, Hartland?
We're still here. We're still alive and kicking. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Phil. So I'm just going to jump into some questions. We are going to structure this today as a Q&A. Devin and I have often had questions that we either don't know necessarily the answers to, or perhaps are interested in hearing feedback from others who are in the space, and someone who's kind of got more their ears to the ground. So in Phil's case, he's able to draw on a large base globally for his data. And so we have the pleasure to be able to get his expertise and perspective. So one of the first questions that Devin and I thought about was sort of in light of all the changes in the past year as a result of COVID, how has that impacted the infrastructure space? And I hate to sort of start off with a COVID question, because I think we're all over that, but at the same time, it's certainly a relevant question. And so to what degree you see the space changing, and I'll leave it sort of open-ended there, Phil.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been we just went through a pretty crazy year. I think the infrastructure space, like all facets of life, was impacted by the pandemic. I would say that it's been, the infrastructure space, is probably, I like to describe it, it's very resilient. It's resilient to these kind of large swings in the macroeconomic environment that a pandemic can bring on. And I like to refer people back to, if you think about it, and this is kind of our thesis, is that while we think the sector has been resilient, there's obviously been some good, there's been some bad, and that's kind of, our thesis has been that it's a bit of an offsetting effect, and that's allowed the space to, in general, continue to push forward and continue to grow in a similar pattern and trajectory that it has in the past. And I often refer people back to what happened in 08, 09. Many of us were in the business then, and the financial crisis also had similar in the sense that it had a very negative impact on the economy. But at that time, this industry was a little more in its infancy, and actually, pushed right through that environment without too much issue. In fact, at that time, I would argue that it was kind of lay the foundation for the rise of public cloud, because at the time, so many decision makers were, very, very curious, not curious, but were very much interested in understanding how they could become more efficient and outsourcing their infrastructure using the cloud. Moving their data centers into a co-location environment was a conversation they may not have had, and in some cases, a model they did not even understand fully. They started to ask questions, and then they started to move and respond and use outsourcing. And then shortly thereafter, not coincidentally, we saw the sector continue to grow. You fast forward another decade, I would argue that a similar thing is happening. I think the sector is obviously way more mature. The public cloud is a real thing now. But the kind of the ecosystem, the entire kind of outsourced infrastructure ecosystem has grown in that 10 years. And it's going to respond in a similar way, I think, in the sense that there is going to be a continued acceleration in digital infrastructure services, and the underlying value proposition of working, not just outsourcing, but working with a service provider, I think is extremely important, and I think just resonates even more clearly when you look at the backdrop and say, wow, look at all that's happened, and organizations that are running their businesses are every day figuring, well, how can I change? What can I do more efficiently? How can I take advantage of the internet? When they ask those questions often are asked of service providers, of consultants, people in the managed services space. And that's exactly what I think is going to be a positive for the sector. Of course, the larger macroeconomic stuff will play itself out.
So do you see that COVID has been a bit of an impetus for people to move more into the cloud because of the fact that they're not at the office and they can't babysit the server, so to speak? And so now, hey, wait a second, it used to be work fine when we had somebody in the office all the time, but if there was advice previously to move to the cloud and a reluctance to do so, has this been a kind of a kick in the pants that some people might have needed to make that move?
Hey, Hartland, sorry, do you mind if I just interject for a second? Hartland, if you press F11, it should make it full screen.
Okay.
Sorry, Phil.
Yeah, no worries. I definitely think that there's that's had an impact. I think that just the fact in a pandemic environment, it becomes very clear that just moving around and entering facilities can be very challenging, and in certain cases can create unsafe conditions that people want to avoid, especially when it comes to just employee safety. So yeah, I think that it's really opened people's eyes up to the importance of remote management tools, the importance of other types of cloud-based infrastructure services that you can literally just point and click and log on to, as well as the fact that you may need a helping hand. Your organization may need somebody who's already set up the kind of tools and the infrastructure to handle a distributed or remote workforce, offsite based infrastructure. Having the help of a service provider take care of that is extremely important. So yeah, kicking the seat of the pants is not is pretty accurate, I think, and I think that's a good thing for the sector.
Yeah, interesting. That's sort of what was our sense, but more sort of anecdotally than anything else. Excellent. Do you see? So the next question is: do you see an appetite for the North American equivalent of GDPR coming down the road? I mean, we've seen privacy policies put in place and data protection in various jurisdictions with the GDPR in Europe, but of course Canada and California have their own rules. What are your thoughts in terms of trying to sort of standardize this process, and where do you see North America fitting in? Can Canada and the US have some kind of overarching policy on this, do you think?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. I'm not overly familiar with the nuances of GDPR, but I would say that I think I think most jurisdictions in the world are headed in this direction. I think for now, the most important kind of line in North America anyways, between, of course, the 49th parallel between Canada and the US. I think there was, it's going to be much, that demarcation will be much more clear. I think organizations have already kind of moved to make sure that, that they're a Canadian organization, that they're going to be running, if they're going to be running on AWS or Azure or with a hosting company, that hosting company has the data center in Canada, and that they can control and manage and have transparency into how that data is handled. So, in terms of that moving along the provincial or state level in the future, you mentioned California. I think that's probably inevitable. I think that it'll probably take some time to play out, but I think for now, at least the near term, national borders will matter the most, and then we'll see as it plays out in the future. But this I think is just a natural byproduct of the fact that so much more of our lives, business, personal, is moving online, and that dictates a closer look at how that data is managed and who has access to it and how it's used.
Yeah, it's certainly an evolving space, and recent changes with WhatsApp sharing data and whatnot. I think it's going to be interesting to see how all this plays out, and maybe that sort of ties into, to some degree, the next question, which is with Biden having been sworn in yesterday, so with the new administration, what changes do you anticipate for IT service providers? What might be on his kind of as part of his mandate to address that might impact them, do you think, or that you know of?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We're going to be making these comments in Canada, north of the border. And certainly, it's been an interesting year on the political front. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's going to be, massive changes in the landscape in the next year. I think the focus of the new administration is clearly on the pandemic environment. But I think you're seeing some interest, just what happened this month actually with certain content platforms, major ones, deleting certain users or preventing certain users, or flagging certain users, and then other sites being completely taken off public cloud infrastructure. I think that's probably, the big issue that we're going to expect to see more of a conversation about in 2021, is to what extent can you regulate content, and that's a big issue. I think it does not just apply to the large social media platforms, the public clouds. I think MSPs, hosters, service providers, independent ones are all involved in this ecosystem, and I think they will be sort of dragged along in that conversation, in the sense that this is a tightly integrated ecosystem that's built on a number of different building blocks: carriers, data center operators, network providers, and they will have to, they tend to, I think the history shows, almost not self-regulate, but there's a certain amount of consistency in the direction that they go. So I think you can expect to see that what's happened, even in just the last few weeks, is probably going to, continue to play out. And I think you'll see more attention paid to it when it comes to terms of service, accessible use policies. I think that will be, probably something that gets more attention, maybe, as we move this environment, then after we get into, hopefully, a post-pandemic environment.
Yeah, it's certainly. Oh, go ahead, Evan.
I was going to say, it's interesting. I was thinking about similar things recently, and there's a concept from outside of IT that I think applies nicely here, which is the social license. The community allows you to do business within it, essentially, and we're seeing that extended more to IT service providers, where activists are reaching out for, Parler would probably be the most prominent example, right? AWS took it down. So that you could argue that in the tech ecosystem, they didn't really have the social license to operate, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing yet. It's certainly an interesting topic, though.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting part here is the political political persuasions behind, whether it's the media or the companies themselves, and how that, if at all, is impacting their terms of service. So all of a sudden, it's controlled. A set of users is controlled by the political preferences. So it's going to be interesting to follow, no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that it would be that, would managed service providers in the future perhaps be pressured from activist groups to stop doing business? I mean, I haven't really heard that for managed service providers in particular. It's been more the infrastructure providers or the social media companies, but I wonder if it might get a little bit more, going after smaller companies in the future too. I could see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'll maybe jump in. I think, obviously it'd be because of the size of those companies, they've tended to avoid that kind of attention. But I think if there's kind of momentum flowing from the top, from some of the large platforms, that there'll be a certain amount of peer pressure, almost like on other companies to kind of work within the framework. Maybe it's not an official framework, or but one that has certain elements and pressure points that people will probably feel they need to comply with. So yeah, I mean, it's I think that's right now, it looks like that's the direction we're heading. It'll be fascinating to see how it plays out. It certainly wouldn't be easy for a separate kind of, there'll be kind of called rogue providers here or there, or who don't feel they need to comply or want to run out on their own. But it would be, as this ecosystem is built, I mean, it'd be extremely difficult, you would think, for a separate ecosystem to emerge. So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, good. Well, look, another question that Deb and I were sort of pondering was this question about ISVs and the kind of proliferation, I guess, of ISVs. And ISVs are, of course, on the hosting and infrastructure side, which, I don't know, Phil, your perspective, I think there's been consolidation there already, and I would say that the growth of those serving the infrastructure and hosting space has been a little less in recent years, I suppose, than it was at one point. Where we're seeing a lot is ISVs serving the managed services space, managed service providers, and kind of a lot of up and coming providers that are trying to align themselves with various distributors, and then there may be a channel play, or they may be tools for service providers to use themselves. And I don't know, to what degree this is something that you spend a lot of time following as the sort of on the periphery, I suppose, of the industry, but serving these the providers. So what are your thoughts with respect to kind of where that's going, consolidation, and anything else in terms of trends there?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I think there's some great technology companies out there that supply the tools and the technology that service providers aggregate and use to deliver the services that they provide to customers. I think that these organizations obviously are I think provide a valuable service, continue to innovate. I think that they are, one of the things I've noticed is I think that they are looking at how the ecosystem is evolving and kind of trying to expand kind of their capabilities to other types of service providers. So whereas you may have seen a certain type of vendor focus just on hosters, or just on communication service providers, telcos, you're starting to see those lines blur a bit. I think, and that I think reflects kind of the overlap that you're seeing between companies that were focused on hosting, MSPs that were focused a bit, maybe less on hosting and a bit more on on-premise infrastructure and remote services, and those are more on the communication services side. So I think you're seeing some of that. I think if you ask about consolidation, I would say it's probably more of the same. I've never thought of this space as being one that consolidates quickly and steadily like the hosting space has over the last decade and a half. But where there are things that make sense, and that you should expect that to happen. So, but yeah, I mean, I don't know if I see any acceleration of that happening. I think it'll happen strategically and where it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think your point, it's an interesting one. You talk about some of these providers moving into telco, or from telco to managed service providers or whatnot. I think from my experience anyway, some of that is as a result of product market fit, right? They might have just not been able to get traction with one of those groups and change gears. I know one company in particular was struggling in the hosting space to get traction, and then seemed to get a ton of traction with managed service providers. So that may be a piece of it as well.
Yeah, and just the fact, and I would add just the fact that so many, service providers of all shapes and sizes and from different parts of the market all seem increasingly to have some sort of hosting cloud-based infrastructure service that they're offering within their larger portfolio. And so, yeah, they're going to be consuming some of the tools that you need to provide those services.
Right. Yeah, it's true. It's another angle of that question. All right, well, let's switch gears a little bit. Web hosting trends. So, this is a question you've probably had, Phil, 100 times or more over the years, and I've certainly had it. The question is web hosting dead? And I guess, we're not talking about application hosting, we're not talking about infrastructure, but we're really talking about hosting focused on the kind of small and mid-market groups and the GoDaddy type models. And of course, we've had the site builder groups come in and pick up some of that market, the web.coms, the Squarespaces, Wixes, those types of players. But what are your thoughts with respect to sort of the lower end of the market? And a lot of times it's going to be WordPress kind of customers.
Well, I appreciate the provocative title and question. And yes, it's a question as an analyst I think I've had numerous times dating back, and interestingly enough, dating back like a decade. So, which I think says something that question keeps getting asked. But I think it's I would look at it this way. I don't think web hosting is dead, but I definitely think it's changed. Right. And so, and that's why you've seen even the terminology has shifted, right? Like web hosting is just, the term is used a bit less than it was, 10, 15 years ago. So in that sense, I don't think web hosting went away. It just changed in the way it's delivered. It's changed in the business model. So you mentioned the site builders, right? They've showed that a freemium approach is a way that you can expand the scope of a customer base and then monetize through freemium, by giving something away and then monetizing the services on top. So that's one way, one significant way it's changed. And hosting has started to become packaged in with other services. So it's not necessarily even thought of as kind of standalone pure web hosting. It's packaged with some other type of service. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's dead. There's still obviously a need for web presence. It's just, it may not be what it once was. It's not as standalone it doesn't live on its own island as it used to. Now it's more about being kind of a centralized, personalized identity and web presence that's that is a central kind of almost management point for what you do online. That could be how it extends to social media, to wherever you're selling online, or to what tools you're using. So it's very much changed in that sense. I think of hosting now is just kind of the core foundation of additional layers of value add. And I think, Hartland, that's what you do. It's what you help with your clients, is you help them build, and market and sell the value add, that they need, to provide value for customers. So yeah, I mean, hosting has come a long way. There's certainly stuff out there and providers out there that continue to have viable businesses, maybe not growing 20-30%, but still growing, and looking a little more like they did before. But I think you'll see that gradually fade away. And I think we've been in a decade-long process in the web hosting space of reinventing ourselves and looking for different areas to drive value, different areas to different ways to deliver the service. The underlying technology and infrastructure is still the same, but some of the end user experience has obviously changed, and I think providers need to be cognizant of that, and not get caught waking up one day and finding that everybody evolved and changed, and you didn't. So yeah.
And we had another question that's very much tied to this one, and is just the future. So I don't know if there's anything more you want to add, but sort of where like we talked about, you said you had that question 10 years ago, and I remember that question, and people were saying, well, it's going to be dead in 5 years, and as you said, here we are 10 years later, or perhaps even more, and so we're cast our minds back here to that question. Well, if we were to do the same in another 10 years, do you see there be any sort of incremental changes that we've seen, or is there going to be some fundamental shift to how these services are provided and provisioned, and the types of vendors that are going to be supporting that space?
Yeah, I mean, I think with much with infrastructure, and it's probably going to be in the middle of those more extreme kind of scenarios. I think the sector has always kind of evolved and changed incrementally. There's still, there's always the new, but there's a lot of the old that's still viable, and then guys who've kind of taken 1 or 2 steps in some direction, and continue to see viable, have a viable business. So I think you see, it's more of that kind of just gradual change, because the core, when we do market share data analysis, and when we look at the sector, there's always, no matter how much change is happening, there's always that core foundation that kind of just continues every month. Customers pay their bills. Churn rates in the sector have historically been low. They probably a little higher these days than they were 10 years ago, but they're still, in general, in big picture, if you look at the market on an aggregate basis, they're still relatively, so that foundation doesn't, it'll probably peel off over time, but it takes time, which is the message. And while that's happening in kind of these more established shared VPS markets, say Western Europe, North America, there is a lot more, there are a lot more markets around the world that are probably at, where we were years ago, in some of the more mature markets. And so those markets, obviously, they're not going to evolve the same way. The services they will, deliver are not going to look the same that they did the way this, the shared and VPS category grew up. But they'll essentially be delivering those kinds of services in a similar kind of month-to-month recurring model, kind of base infrastructure, a little bit of services. You'll see that in developing markets around the world. And so if you look at the market on a global basis, I think it's, it's fair to think that this market will just continue to push along.
So it's like we talked about some of the questions, but you're kind of leading into the next question each time, Phil. So the next one I had is, what part of the world is hosting still growing? From our perspective, essentially, and this might be a little bit simplistic, but our experience has generally been that if a customer, customer of ours, but if a service provider is acquiring a customer today, there's a reasonably good chance that they're taking it from another provider. That's so they're leaving that provider and moving over. And of course, there's new business, and new businesses are starting, and so there's customers who are starting with a new need entirely. But there's also a lot of stealing from your competitors, if you like. So I know that that's not happening in all parts of the world. So I guess my question is sort of where do you see hosting still growing more quickly, right? And we talked about 20 or 30% a moment ago, and those were numbers that were easily possible 10, 15 years ago, and I'm sure are still happening in some markets. Are we talking about BRIC countries? Are they still growing at those kinds of numbers? What's your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely regions around the world where the growth is faster. Where there's still more upside, where there's still people just starting to come online. Obviously, the people, not all of them are going to head for hosting. I think that's one thing to keep in mind, right? There are different options, right? They may end up at something like a site builder. They may go directly to social media and not really come years later back to having kind of that standardized web presence I spoke of. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, Latin America. Brazil, I mean, these are fast growing internet markets. If you look at the Middle East, Africa, still developing. And then if you move to the Asia region, there's two places I think where you're going to still see a lot of growth. One of them is obviously India, right? Just a massive growth potential. And another one is Indonesia, which is actually, some people tend to forget, is the fourth most populous country in the world. And actually has is just in the earlier stages of its development of internet technology and use of internet technology. At the same time, of course, they're massive mobile users, and it's just kind of the web presence and that element is still in relative infancy. So if you kind of look at those parts of the world and understand the potential and the fact that many people are just starting to get online and just evolve more of their lives around technology, you see the growth potential.
Yeah. I was going to say for Indonesia, it's an interesting example because I've read that for people in Indonesia, their experience online to a large degree is confined to Facebook. Like they don't really even have like a conceptual difference between the broader internet and Facebook. Facebook is the portal. So I wonder if that would, maybe as that market matures, maybe more stores would move from Facebook stores to, having their actual website for e-commerce and all that. So I speculate, but I just wonder.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily even move, it's extend and integrate, right? So there's nothing, what's great about these social platforms is obviously the reach and the connections to people, network, and potential customers if you're doing business. But yeah, integrating and connecting with kind of personalized and centralized web presence is something they may actually come back to later. I think it's a viable theory, and it could apply in many markets around the world.
And I guess the takeaway from a marketing perspective is, if you're marketing into a region where the internet is viewed as Facebook, then Facebook advertising is probably more appealing than it would be otherwise.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, and Phil, I like your interesting point about Indonesia, and I'd sort of lost sight of, and I've been there, but lost sight of the size of the country. And one of the things that I'm privy to in looking at acquisition opportunities is to look at the distribution of the customer base, and if it's WHMCS or something doing a report on distribution by country. I'm going to take a little bit closer look to see Indonesia. It certainly hasn't been on my radar and hasn't stood out as a country that's made up anywhere close to a significant number of a portion of a customer base, I guess. And so that's interesting. So yeah, thanks for bringing that one up. So just moving on here a little bit, talking about vendors, we've all heard the kind of grumblings now for, I don't know what it was, a year and a half or something. I can't remember when cPanel first raised their prices, but there's I guess there's been impacts, right? I know for firsthand from a number of groups who have indicated that they're moving away from cPanel or passing the pricing increases along to their customer base, running on other panels in parallel, looking for alternative options. I just wondered, what you've seen, what you've heard, and I guess the strategy, I suppose, behind cPanel's increase in price, and what your thoughts are. Is that smart? Obviously, they were acquired, and then a lot of these changes took place. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, probably haven't followed this as closely as I should have, but I think that the feedback that I've heard on the on the ground is similar to how you described. And I don't necessarily think that it's I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that the values of the value of these technologies and the services that they help produce is reinforced or increased. This industry has always kind of had that battle against commoditization and pricing pressure, and everybody, the early days of the sector, everybody was trying to outdo themselves on price because they felt that was the only way they could differentiate. And that changed as the industry matured. People realized that you can do other things to drive value add, and so yeah, I mean, who knows? It obviously it's an operating expense for a lot of providers out there, and certainly has impact. Don't want to discount that. But I think there could be, it's always good for the industry to reinforce to value and to hold the line and say, hey, listen, we're delivering an important service. The building blocks it requires resources and money to develop this technology, to innovate, and then to deliver that to the customer. I think it's up to the sector if it requires passing that cost down to the customer, then it's up to the sector and providers to build value and to demonstrate it and show that to the customer. And if they do, they'll continue to be successful because if you have something valuable, people are going to pay for it, as long as it's not completely out of whack. There's nothing wrong with stepping away from previous years' expectations and trying to set new ones. I think it's entirely possible.
Yeah.
Demonstrate value. Yeah.
Well, I think there's certainly value there, and the customers like cPanel. From what I gather, there's a lot of sort of preference on the customer side, but at some point, it's just not going to make economic sense. But I think if this were happening 10, 15 years ago, a lot of providers would go out and make their own panel, right? Nowadays, there's more of a reluctance to do that, and more interest in sort of buying something off the shelf. But so look, we've talked a little bit here about we talked about infrastructure. We talked briefly about the changes there, and we talked about managed service providers. But we have a lot of MSPs who either are we're working with from a marketing perspective, or who are subscribers to our mailing list for opportunities of IT companies for sale. And so to kind of move into a little bit more of their territory, what should MSPs be looking for in an infrastructure provider? MSPs is a very broad term, and there's a lot of different services that are provided, although many of them are fairly sort of core to the offering around backup and security solutions and whatnot. And some will go further down the road around supporting infrastructure. It may be in the cloud with a hyperscaler. It may be with a more of a private cloud, and then of course there's still those customers that are in the back closet that are being supported. So, if MSPs want to align themselves with an infrastructure provider and are trying to evaluate, should it be a hyperscaler, in other words, Google, AWS, Azure, etc., or should they align themselves with a smaller operator who may be local to them, for instance? How might they go about this, and what opportunities exist for MSPs?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key question for MSPs and service providers, the key question for them to ask themselves is to first look at their own business. What is it? What is my value proposition? What do customers look to my service for? Is it a great user experience, my handling of customers? Then that's where I should be investing. And if that's where I'm investing, then I should be looking, perhaps for, the type of underlying infrastructure scenario that makes sense. Am I still? Oh, sorry. Sorry, guys. A little bit here. So for an organization that is really great at managing customers, then they want an underlying infrastructure service that's affordable, efficient, scalable, and easy to use. If it's like a WordPress hosting organization, their value proposition is around handling WordPress, optimizing it, and they might want to look for a service that makes sense for them. So recently you made Flywheel, a company that was acquired by WP Engine. They never rack and stacked their own servers or procured data centers. They started on DigitalOcean, but they moved and said, I think they decided to go with Google Cloud. And that was because they used a container, they made their decision based on the fact that they want to use containers, and they're heavy users of Kubernetes to manage all that. I mean, there's no, I think it's to understand your business, understand how the underlying technology fits with that. And I think that's how you go about it. There's no right or wrong. I think it's a matter of finding the right fit.
So, I mean, how would you describe then the different options that are available? I mean, if you were to put these into kind of more simplistic buckets in terms of what's available to them, how would you sort of for MSPs that might not be offering this or are feeling like they don't have a very compelling offering, how should they think about this question in terms of their options?
So you mean in terms of how, like, should I go completely asset light? Should I get rid of my data centers or?
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. So what are the options available to them? We've got the hyperscalers. We've got local providers. What's almost a bit like is there a decision tree that they could use? Are you doing X? Yes or no? Okay, go this way. Are you, does the customer want Y? Yes or no? And follow. And is there some kind of easy way for MSPs to try to navigate this space?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something like that, right? Because again, every business is different. So, as an example, if you if you're trying to decide between like a DigitalOcean and a public cloud platform, and you felt that you needed more global footprint or the potential to serve customers around the world, you might want to go with one of the larger platforms out there. So that would make sense. Cost is obviously something that matters, and so you could that would be another factor to consider. The tool sets, your internal expertise, which API are we familiar with or like working with? What are the types of tools on that platform that matter to our business? All of that, I think, plays a role. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, in describing the landscape, I think right now I would probably think of it like this. They're still proprietary, obviously. You can do things yourself. You can go to the public cloud, and then there's that second tier that a DigitalOcean. Previous to that, a lot of people were running off something like SoftLayer. Linode is something you can do. So that's kind of in in the second tier, and then there's certain people, certain organizations who will probably double up a bit, or depending on
Right.
again what service they have. Some people are running data centers and are using the cloud for just to help customers, using it to enable a backup service that they're offering, right? So they're still running private clouds and dedicated servers and things like that, but they're like, yeah, this makes sense, cheap underlying infrastructure, I'll just use some third-party software and I'll create a new backup service. So kind of a more strategic approach, putting that into your portfolio. I think that makes sense too. So yeah.
So you mentioned price, and I'm wondering, is there a simple answer to the question of what is the more inexpensive option, whether it's a public cloud or looking, as you said, like at one of the data center operators, infrastructure providers? Because my anecdotal experience has been that there are groups who are doing both, but that the public cloud pricing models can get out of hand if you're not managing it, and that's a little less likely to be the case with some of the infrastructure providers, or let's call them the smaller private infrastructure providers, and also that there's a question of where the company's at in terms of its I guess growth and demand. That although you get the scalability with the public cloud, that the pricing can also kind of skyrocket and get away from you quickly. And so in the earlier days, it seems attractive, but as time goes on, it becomes more expensive than alternative options. Do you have any comments around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to add in terms of cost is to not think of it on as as to take a kind of a larger picture view of cost, because it's not just the underlying cost of the compute and storage infrastructure. Sure. It's also the network costs, and then of course the human resources required internally to manage that. So yeah, I don't think there's any easy formula or apples to apples, oranges to oranges comparison. I think it's a matter of matching it up with the business requirements, with your customers and what they need and the products they consume and the price points they're willing to pay you. So yeah, I think that's how we do approach it.
Okay.
Yeah,
that makes sense. So for those who aren't familiar, Phil has had, I guess, Phil, a couple times now. You've in May puts on a infrastructure summit, and that takes place has taken place anyway in Toronto, and this was prior to COVID. So the last time, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that you ran it was 2019. So I think it was 2018 and 2019, Phil, if my memory serves me correctly, and that unfortunately last year, 2020, had to be canceled, and then this year I think you're looking to do something virtual. But in at least one of those years, if not both, there was a fairly heavy kind of component and topics around edge computing, and I'm not. It sort of seemed to be the talk of the town, if you like, at one point, and I'm not seeing quite as much, and maybe it's just the exposure that I have to those discussions. But I guess I'm just sort of curious, like, where's the opportunity for MSPs around edge computing and other kind of channel partners? Like, where's that going? What might they consider getting involved with? Where do you see the kind of the next big thing that the managed service providers who have the feet on the ground, that are in communication with these businesses, and where could they take advantage of some additional potential revenue streams and growth here going forward?
Yeah, and thanks for mentioning. Yeah, it's definitely our event where we talk about kind of what's going on in the infrastructure services sector. It has definitely picked up the conversation on edge. We feel it's I think big picture. I think it's the base. I think it's going to drive how the industry kind of evolves over the next decade. So I think the decade that we just went through was very much about centralized public cloud infrastructure build out, and of course the ecosystem kind of is dragged along with it. And then what you'll see in the next decade is a decentralization, moving from kind of centralized, large clusters of infrastructure to smaller increments dispersed all across different geographies, in a geography, sorry, different locations in a geography, and then even further as it tries to, within, even within cities. I think at the end of the day, it's about getting compute, high performance or increasingly high performance compute closer to end users. And so, yeah, so that is where kind of that next wave, we would argue, of infrastructure development and expansion is going to happen. The and what I think makes it unique, different from, is that it's, this major public cloud, centralized public cloud build out involved less pieces of kind of the rest of the ecosystem, independent service providers, MSPs. Whereas I think, and what's I think interesting about the edge build out is it may not play out that same way, right? The public clouds were able to take advantage of economies of scale. But in an edge scenario, it's a bit trickier, and the build out will not necessarily involve the level of scale. Will not be able to exert the advantage of scale as obviously. They're going to be involved. They already are. They're building out different types of products. But I think at the end of the day, because it's new, because it's a more nascent and developing area. When those pockets emerge in a sector, I think it creates opportunity for service providers, and that means addressing that next generation. There's going to be a new generation of workloads that are being developed now and are going to mature and flourish in the next decade. So trying to look ahead to that, our message to MSPs has been, think about this opportunity is going to open up kind of your addressable market. A lot of service providers have served kind of a tighter or smaller subset of customers. And once the edge builds out, there's going to be a new generation of workloads, different types of customers that are going to present infrastructure opportunities that ecosystem will just be an extension of everything else that's happening out there in outsourced infrastructure. So I think it's obviously very early stages, but I think there's going to be some very interesting and new companies, and some of the companies that are already involved, quite frankly, come from a hosting a data center background. A lot of those guys are familiar names that grew up in this, the hosting space for the last 20 years, and are applying the same skill sets, because it's still the same building blocks, the same underlying infrastructure. They're just doing it in a different way, deploying it a different way, creating a different supply chain, different user experience, different different business model. Well, similar, I should say. So yeah, that's what I think is what's exciting about it, and I think MSPs should be thinking about that, especially as their customers ask them about expansion, not just give me more capacity, give me more storage, give me can you give me more service, but can you take me to a second location, a third location? Can you get me out to the edge as my customer base expands and my performance requirements become more complex and enhanced over time?
Are there any particular industries? I mean, MSPs in some cases they specialize. They might specialize in terms of well, I mean, they're geographically specific in a lot of cases, certainly not all, and they're specific in terms of like the services that they provide. But aligned with that is in some cases a specialization with industry, right? The legal industry, manufacturing space. They support government, healthcare, education, whatever it is, or a few of those. Is there any opportunity, you think, in particular around edge computing with any industries that MSPs might want to kind of consider as part of their targeting by industry, knowing that there's going to be a growing opportunity around edge computing in some of those areas? And one, for instance, that comes to mind is the home services and how do you say it? Even for businesses like HVAC companies and whatnot that are out in the field, they've got technicians out in the field servicing equipment, servicing homes, servicing businesses, and who need to have tools kind of at their fingertips rather. Like I don't know. Are there any that you think kind of come to mind in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think healthcare and like telehealth, I think was what we're calling it. I think that's an interesting one, that because there are MSPs that serve various different types of healthcare organizations, and with this pandemic, kind of your healthcare provider, a lot of healthcare is starting to happen in an online through an online medium,
and we've been forced to, right, with COVID.
Yeah,
it's
exactly, and people are everywhere, right? They're and it's a service that's critical, that's going to require a good a consistent and good performance level expectations. So that one could be interesting. I think and of course everything around IoT devices. Everybody talks about autonomous vehicles. I think we're probably still a ways away from that. But yeah, serving devices that are going to be in homes, and homes are everywhere, of course, out into second tier locations. I think those are interesting opportunities. That kind of relates to what I think you were getting at in terms of kind of construction workers, people doing work, and they're doing work on homes or facilities, and those can be sometimes further out there, where performance kind of degrades or where there's less infrastructure. So yeah, I think those kinds are just the tipping point of what we could see going forward.
Right. Yeah, construction could be an interesting one too. Yeah. Good. Look, Phil, thank you so much for this. This has been a really interesting and fantastic opportunity to chat with you. We are coming up literally right to the kind of top of the hour, and this was perfect timing. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out. You have our contact details, info at the host broker or info at eBridge Marketing Solutions. Phil, you can be reached info at structureresearch.net, right? Or Phil Shih on LinkedIn. And Shih is SHIH.
Yep.
And is there any other way that people might want to reach out to you, Phil? Are those good options?
No, that's all good options. Yep.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it. And we will wrap up there.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Phil.